In fact, I think it's one of the books that tells you what to expect simply from its title. I do hope it is funny, freaky, foodie, and feisty. As the title suggests, it is a book of poems. It's published by Scholastic. It's been a while since it first came out, 2009. It's the one poetry book of mine that has gone into endless reprints, which fills me with delight because it also says something about the fact that children do read poetry contrary to received wisdom if the poetry appeals to who they are, where they live, if it tickles the funny bone, as I hope some of the poems do. And so I think really the attempt in this book was for me to address a lacunae that I felt growing up, despite being an avid reader, despite being a lover of poetry, despite studying English literature and going on to write poetry, I always felt a certain, I was mystified, I think, by the fact that why is there such a huge gap between our own lived experience and our own realities and the poetry we study. So, this book begins with a poem that is titled "I'm Sick of Learning Lochinvar," and I think that says everything about the motivation for writing the book. I'm sick of learning Lochinvar. I'm sick of Robert Frost. Kept stopping by those snowy woods. Why didn't he go get lost? That's how I begin the first poem that begins this book. And the narrator goes on to say, if someone ever asked me, as if someone ever would, I'd tell them what I'd like. That makes the poem good. And ends by despairing that where will I ever find such poems on the shelf? Who cares? I'll find a better way. I'll write them all myself. So this was really what I was doing in this book. I think one reason why children seem to be wary of poetry is the way it is taught. So all the pleasure is sucked out of it when you have to answer reference to context questions. When the context itself is not familiar, it's not going to be a fun place to live in. I would say that's one reason. For adults, the reason is pretty much the same, because the way they've studied poetry has not been conducive to enjoyment. So these are the reasons why people are afraid of poetry. They find it obscure maybe. Even I, as a practitioner, have loved poetry, but it's only later that I came back to the masters and started appreciating them. It's the lack of a familiar context. So for example, daffodils and babbling brooks, I don't care if they are pretty. I'd rather read a wicked poem about living in my city. That's the attempt for me, is how can I familiarize the strange, because the strange should not be kept out of my appreciation, but how do I also introduce the familiar into the strange world of poetry? I think I'll start with a poem that is towards the end of the book, which is a section on poetry. There are 3 poems there, and I wrote this again in that sort of cheeky way, but it's cheekiness directed at myself as the poet. Poetry is for poets. Poetry is for poets, and poets are all weird. Would you really write a poem if you could grow a beard? Poetry is for sissies, and a sissy isn't me. I'm a cool dude, hero kind, the coolest I can be. Poetry is for crackpots. And why are crackpots cracked? Their poems are so awful that they have gotten whacked. Poetry is for losers who haven't got a clue. So why is this a poem? It's what I love to do. So, this is, the I here is clearly a boy. So, I'm inhabiting another narrator, but I'm enjoying the fact that he is my alter ego. The other 2 little poems I'll read are from a series called The Food Finagle, which has a subtitle, A Capricious Culinary Caper. And here I think I'm playing with the fact that in India we have so many kinds of snacks, and also the way in which, because of our many languages, there's one which I won't read. It's called Snakes, which is about snacks. and I just have fun playing with the fact that in one state a particular word means something else, and in another state it means something else. This is my take on idlis and dosas, which I absolutely love. Idli pom. Idli lost its fiddly, dosa lost its crown, vada lost its violin, and let the whole band down. Kids love this because they're like, oh my god, we haven't seen this band before. The other one that I wrote personally, it's a little personal indulgence of mine. It's called the Samosa Feud. I'm, as you know, a Bengali, so this comes from that place. The Samosa Feud. There is an old feud that is waiting to be settled. Call a samosa a shingara and the Punjabi gets nettled. Call a shingara a samosa and the Bengali gets mad. While the two are fighting, there's a plateful to be had. You know, I had never thought of having my poetry illustrated. The idea came from the publisher, and I have to confess, I had a momentary doubt about how it would work, because I have this great dread of illustrations being illustrative. And in none of my poems, any book of my poems for adults, this was my first one written intentionally for children, and the publisher felt that the illustrations would add a necessary dimension to this book of poetry, and I was a bit hesitant until they showed me Priya's work. So this is illustrated by Priya Kuriyan, illustrations by Priya Kuriyan, and it was I think an inspired pairing, because the minute I saw what she had done, first few samples, I realized that my eccentricity, whimsicality, strangeness, loopiness, all of it had been picked up by Priya and reinterpreted in her visual style. So I got very excited because I'm also very interested in the way pages look. So we did work together. So she would send me, for example, there's one poem about the death which had way too many gravestones. So I remember telling Priya, can we, remove some of those? She was very open to that. She did some fantastic stuff like this poem, which is called Spooky, where you can see it's a reverse, and it's just delirious, and sometimes she made me realize what the character might look like. For example, in a poem called Loco, Uncle Jay, I had not envisioned him as a pot-bellied little fellow, but there he is, pot-bellied. Then she did things with, here is a writer making lists, and she used it as a framing device. I absolutely adore this one. It's a tiny poem called Fear and Denial Are Two Orange Cats. So, it was simply a match that worked, but it was a very inspired pairing by the editor at Scholastic. Look at this one. It's called Go Away, or What the Intolerant Said. And here is a board which is telling you to go away. So she really thought, this is about an illustrator reading the poems, internalizing the poems, and then approaching the poems through her own visual style and sensibility. That worked really well. I think they appreciate the humor the most, yeah, especially on a first interaction. So I also pick the funny poems to read because I also want to entice them into this world. So I pick the funny poems, I pick the food poems because that cuts across wherever I travel, the food resonates. There's a poem called Spooky. I just tried to show you the illustration of that page. They love that. I often end my reading sessions with that, because I prep it by saying, let's switch off the lights if I can, and we read it. It's a list poem about all the things that could be spooky. That they love because it's an interactive poem. I make them say spooky in, scared voices, shivery voices, etc. I think they like the fact that there is room in these poems for them to participate. And that's not evident always when you pick up a book, but in a reading interaction that becomes evident. There's a series of poems which is written like drama pieces. I'm just trying to remember what the title was, where I encourage them to, it's called a series of aftermaths. After the horror movie, after the illness. And I've given voice instructions to be read after the illness, to be read in a very feeble voice, after the horror movie to be read in a nervous voice. There's one after eating a lot of pizza and Coke. And that poem, I'm very apologetically, I have to admit that poem is composed mainly of burps. Because so these are the kind of things that adults don't encourage, you see. And here they find that it's in a poem, it's structured, so linguistically I am being faithful to my craft, but I'm allowing them to play, and they really appreciate that leeway and they warm to those poems. And hopefully when they go away and read it in private, they are able to enter the more contemplative ones as well. I think parents would do very well to read it aloud. Choose poems from the book, read aloud to their child. There is a gamut of poems here, so age groups from 8 upwards, 18. I do know that the adults love the poems as well, because they are also appreciating other things. So I think if a parent reads with his or her child, reads to his or her child, because I think poetry is essentially an oral art. So when you speak it out, especially the poems that are rhymed, the fun will be evident, and the parent will enjoy it. And I have a feeling that a lot of the times, if the child sees the parent enjoying themselves, they'll wonder what is it about that book that makes them laugh, and they'll want to join in that experience. So that would be one thing to do. For teachers in classroom situations, which are a lot trickier because there's the syllabus and all of that to be followed, I would say treat it like an extracurricular event in literature classes or in reading periods, because thematically, again, there is a wealth of material to choose from. So if, for example, if they are studying difference, or studying intolerance, or studying history, or studying travel, or studying food habits, or you can just open this and find a theme that might work. There's a poem called Journal on, it's a journal through South India. So if you're studying, it's got Honavar and Thalassery, these are geographical places. So I think an inventive teacher can possibly just pick up the book and say, today what am I going to talk to the children about? And is there some way in which I can correlate a poem on fear and denial, a poem on a blue heron, or a poem on childhood, a poem on adoption? It's all here, and perhaps it's just a matter of reading creatively, because we lay a lot of emphasis on writing creatively. Perhaps reading creatively can be just as useful.